Hello and welcome to topic 3, lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be defining crime. So topic 3 covers a lot of material. You'll be reading chapter 2 in the textbook, and there's a lot of material that's covered that. You'll also be reading some articles to help us understand trends in crime and how the problems associated with measuring crime. And so just to give you an overview, topic 3, we'll be learning about defining crime. That's what we're going to be learning about in this lecture. You'll be reading about categories of crimes. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the tools we use to measure crime, as well as beginning to look at some of the crime trends, how crime has changed over time in the United States. And then in the textbook, you'll be reading about crime patterns, the certain patterns that we see in terms of criminal activity in the United States. So that's what we've got on the docket. Let's go ahead and get started. When we think about how crimes are defined, it seems like it's a pretty simple endeavor upon first glance. Because when we think about crime and the role of the criminal justice system, the role of the criminal justice system is to keep people safe and have order within a society. And so it seems as if crimes would be simply behavior that is harmful to society, right? And so when you think about how crime is defined, we'd say a crime is a behavior that is prohibited because it causes great harm to society. But when you sort of look at behaviors that are actually criminalized in the United States, or behaviors that are not criminalized in the United States, you might wonder if that's really the best definition for how crime is defined. Because we see that there are some low harm acts that are considered crimes and other high harm acts that are not considered crimes at all. And so, for example, when you think about certain kinds of so-called victimless crimes, where you say, well, look, when somebody engages in this behavior, is there a victim? Is there someone being harmed? Is society being harmed in some way? With certain, victimless crimes or behaviors, you might say that, that these don't seem to be producing much of any harm at all, yet they are criminalized. And so, as we've talked in the past, prostitution is a crime because some might say, why is it a crime? Where's the harm? It's an exchange for sex for money. Somebody is getting a service and somebody is able to provide a service like any other service, one might think. Gambling, that, say, where's the harm in gambling? A person makes a choice. They get a thrill off of engaging in certain sorts of betting endeavors, and then they either win money or a place that is a gambling facility could earn revenue that way for those who bet poorly. And you could say, too, assisted suicide is physician-assisted suicide is criminalized in many states in the United States. And you could say, well, where's the harm there? Somebody wants to end their life. They're of sound mind, and they want the assistance of a doctor who would make sure that the procedure would go as planned with as little pain as possible. And so, you might say, okay, well, why are these considered crimes, particularly if you think and agree that they are behaviors that don't present harm to society? On the flip side of that, you could say that there are some really high harm behaviors that are not considered crimes. I have two up here. One is carbon emissions. The other is the mortgage selling practices that brought about the economic collapse of 2008. Right now we're facing increasing, warming of the planet. And if the increasing warming of the planet is not reversed or stopped, at least at how warm we are right now, there could be some really catastrophic consequences for the world. And a lot of that warming is caused by the emissions associated with the burning of fossil fuel. And so given how harmful carbon emissions are, one might wonder why that is not that behavior isn't criminalized in some way. If you've read anything at all about the economic collapse of 2008, which probably seems like long ago history to you all, but basically because that banks and other mortgage providers were engaging in practices of selling mortgages to people who couldn't afford the mortgages, who were, really did not have a good credit history. And then those mortgages were bundled in a way to be sold on the market in order to make money for those who were buying those bundled mortgages. And when it was discovered that those mortgages were worth nothing, it had devastating consequences for the economy. But those mortgage selling practices weren't criminal then, they're not criminal now. And so it kind of lets us begin thinking about, okay, well then, maybe harm is not the best way of defining what kinds of behaviors should be considered crimes. And so what else is going on if it's not related to harm? So the textbook offers 3 different theories of how behavior is classified as crimes. There's the consensus theory, the conflict theory, and the interactionist theory. And we're going to look at each of these in more detail in the following slides. I do want you to keep in mind that the criminalization of behavior or actions, that's a product of government and politics, okay? Whether or not a behavior is considered a crime is because either the state legislature or the federal legislature passes law that define action as criminal, okay? And so these laws can be a product of politics. And keep in mind as well that if a state legislature does not take action in order to, or a federal Congress doesn't take action to define a behavior as a crime, then it's not considered a crime. And as we know that these criminal laws are a product of politics, okay? And so it is the people who get elected to office, the party that has power within the state or federal Congress, the ideologies of the lawmakers, the donations that they may get from interest groups or from their constituents, all of these can influence what kinds of behaviors are or are not defined as crime. And these different theories are going to help us understand the impact that politics has on how crime is defined. The first viewpoint is known as the consensus view. And I think that when most of us think about how behavior becomes criminalized, we think about and we sort of come from a place of like, oh, well, it's the consensus. It's what the majority of people in a society view as being criminal. And that, that's what consensus is. Consensus means that the majority rules, right? That there's a consensus of wide agreement that something is harmful to society. So as it says there, criminal law is rules set by state authorities that express the norms, values, and goals of the vast majority of people within that society. And so since criminal law is about social control, about controlling those behaviors that are likely to harm society, it's the behaviors that are widely accepted as being harmful that are criminalized, okay? And so in other words, that, the vast majority of people within a society agree that these certain kinds of behaviors like murder and physical assault or any kind of assault, robbery, forcible rape, right? That there's the vast majority of people view those as harmful behaviors that need to be controlled by society. And that's why they are criminalized. And from the consensus view, it's not just these obvious sorts of behaviors that are likely to harm society, but it can be some less obvious ways. So even if a behavior is not regarded as overtly and obviously harmful, the majority of people within that society feels that the behavior causes some type of harm that justifies criminalization. So for example, prostitution. Prostitution is illegal in all 49 states in the United States. Nevada is the only one that it's not criminalized in. And that's because the vast majority of people share the value that there's something immoral about prostitution, and that allowing prostitution can degrade morality, erode morality, and that degradation of morality is harmful to society. And also that prostitution, while it might not be overtly harmful, that it can lead to sort of predatory predatory behaviors if we allow prostitution. That is, people preying upon those who are perhaps most vulnerable within our society, which in and of itself could be seen as harmful, right? But I think that there's a sense that people who participate as prostitutes, that they're being used, not that they are taking their own autonomy and saying, this is what I want to do with my body and my life, right? And so those are some examples that give us an idea of how the consensus view defines crime within the United States. The conflict view offers a very different perspective than the consensus view. While the consensus view is saying that what the majority considers to be harmful is what gets reflected in criminal law, the conflict view basically says that criminal law is a reflection of class structure. And that from their perspective, that those that have the most economic power, they're the ones who end up making laws. And the laws that they make criminalize those behaviors that jeopardize their hold on economic power. And so in other words, criminal law is an extension of the economic power of those who are in lawmaking institutions like state legislatures and the federal Congress. And that they, when it comes to criminal law, that they will criminalize behaviors that jeopardize their economic hold on power. Now, clearly, this viewpoint, not necessarily, apply to, such kind of obviously harmful behaviors like homicide and assault. However, there are some examples that, fit really well into the conflict view. So, for example, that the theft of private property, right? Burglary, larceny, shoplifting, all of that is greatly criminalized in the United States, right? And sure, it's harmful, but it's more property harm, right? That people lose an item of value to them. Not that that's not harmful, but that it's not as harmful as maybe some other activities. However, if you get charged with a property crime, it's a pretty significant penalty in the United States. But when you look at the theft of public revenue, okay, so this is from the conflict view's perspective, that oftentimes the theft of public revenue is not even regarded as theft. So, for example, a public revenue would be tax revenue, the revenue that we collect, that we're supposed to collect, based on our income and based on, other assets that we might have. And as we know that there are a lot of ways that that you can avoid paying taxes that are absolutely legal, but that protect the very wealthy from paying taxes. So like offshoring corporate entities, right? So that you're not subject to federal taxes. And that's tax avoidance, right? And that in a way you are depriving the tax coffers of, the fair share that everybody else is sort of paying on their wealth. And so some might argue that the fact that we have a lot of legal tax avoidance practices that deprive the public coffers of the taxes that are owed is a good example of the conflict view, because there's no question that the theft of private property should be criminalized, but that allowing people not to pay their taxes, making it actually easy to do that, like reinforces those who have economic power, who are making these laws because they don't want to lose the money that they have from their wealth. Some argue that the war on drugs is a good example of the conflict view. That there are many drugs in the United States that are very harmful to people's health, alcohol and tobacco, right? But those are absolutely legal in the United States. Why? People make a lot of money. Again, this is from the conflict view. People make a lot of money from selling alcohol and selling tobacco. However, that selling other kinds of drugs that are either as harmful or some evidence is less harmful, like marijuana and some, opioids, that those are cracked down on, right? Heroin, etc. But the creation of opioids from pharmaceutical companies, right, like OxyContin, that gets into the stream, I mean, that was absolutely legal, right? And so that it's those who have power that are defining which drugs should be criminalized and which drugs remain illegal, and that difference is sort of based on the wealth of those, the economic power of those making those kinds of laws. And then to go back to the harmful mortgage practices that we talked about in earlier slides, those remain legal. Some might say, why do those remain legal? Well, they remain legal because those who are in office and making laws are beneficiaries of those kinds of stock practices, those kinds of mortgage practices, and that's why they do not become criminalized. The interactionist viewpoint argues that criminal law reflects the values, opinions, and preferences of those in power. In other words, that it's those in power that they impose their own values, their own moral code on the rest of the population. And from this viewpoint, they're sort of like lawmakers are considered like moral entrepreneurs, right? It's basically that if you have power within a state legislature or in the federal Congress, right, it's those who have power, it's their moral beliefs that gets reflected in what's considered criminal or not criminal, okay? And so the moral entrepreneurs are groups that persuade society to enforce rules that are consistent with their own moral beliefs, okay? And so that while the moral entrepreneurs may very well be in the lawmaking branches, interest groups can also be moral entrepreneurs, where they basically have a particular moral perspective, and then they donate money or persuade lawmakers to basically pass criminal laws that reflect these moral and value-based beliefs. And so for this perspective, criminal law reflects morals of the morals of those in power, that criminal law doesn't necessarily reflect things that are inherently evil or harmful. And so we've got some examples here. I'll just put them all up. They're not coming up in order. But abortion could be a good example of that, or the criminalization of abortion, okay? Or the legalization of abortion. It's those who have the power that are going to either choose to say abortion is morally wrong, therefore it should be a crime, or on the flip side of that abortion is not morally wrong, that it is an expression of individual autonomy, and therefore it shouldn't be criminalized. Same with assisted suicide. In some states, it seems like that it's moral to allow people to end their lives in a manner in which they choose, particularly if they are facing terminal illness. But others say, nope, that's immoral, that, let God's will be done, and that humans shouldn't interfere with the end of life. Prostitution versus sex workers, right? Some think that it's immoral. Others think that it's just a service like anything else. And then it can also be applied to sort of the morality of smoking cigarettes, or the morality of drinking a martini, right? Oh, well, that's what, that's morally acceptable, but, smoking a blunt or a spliff or whatever, that's immoral, right? And so it gets reflected in criminal law. But as we see changing attitudes about moral entrepreneurs, if those who think that there's absolutely nothing immoral about, smoking pot and, actually producing it for legal consumption, then those are the moral entrepreneurs that are going to, be in making these laws, and those shifts in morals and values can be reflected in criminal law throughout the United States. So now that you've learned about these three views, of these three, which view do you think seems to do the best job of explaining how behaviors get defined as criminal in the United States? I think one of the things you'll find is that just as we saw the 6 perspectives on criminal justice that we learned about last week, how each of them have some important insight in terms of helping us understand the criminal justice system in the United States, I think that you'll probably find that each of these views also offers a unique perspective for how to think about how behaviors are or are not criminalized. Okay, thank you for listening. I appreciate your time and attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.